The family had been planning the big event for weeks. It was the anniversary of the family-owned restaurant, and they were celebrating with a grand gathering. Relatives from all over had flown in, excited to join the celebration. The restaurant had been transformed with beautiful decorations. There were bright lights, flowers everywhere, and a large stage in the center for the evening's entertainment. The smell of delicious food filled the air, and the atmosphere was buzzing with excitement. Everyone was looking forward to the main event of the evening. The star dancer, who was well known in the local dance community, was set to perform. Her dance had been the highlight of the evening for years, and the family had been proud to have her perform at their restaurant's big occasion. The dancers were usually the center of attention, drawing the crowd's eyes as they moved gracefully across the stage. The anticipation for the star dancer's performance was almost unbearable. But just as the night was about to begin, disaster struck. The star dancer, who had been practicing for weeks, suddenly injured her ankle while preparing backstage. It happened so quickly. She fell to the floor, unable to stand, and the entire family rushed to her side. Everyone was in shock. The star dancer had been the most important part of the evening, and now she couldn't perform. There was no backup plan. The family's mood shifted from excitement to panic. The event coordinator, Mrs. Thompson, began to sweat. She quickly realized that without the star dancer, the night would fall apart. The guests were already seated, and they had been waiting for the performance. People began to murmur among themselves, asking questions about what was happening. Was the performance canceled? Would they just sit there and eat without the entertainment they had been promised? As the minutes ticked by, the stress in the room grew. Some family members began to argue. "We need to find someone to replace her," one cousin said. "But who?" Another family member responded. The thought of disappointing the guests seemed unbearable. The night had been planned for so long, and now it was in danger of being ruined. No one knew what to do. Then, just as everyone was about to give up, a young woman stepped forward. She had been sitting quietly in the back, watching the scene unfold. Her name was Emily, and she was a ballerina who had recently joined the family through marriage. Emily had never performed at a large event like this, but she had danced for many years. Her style was different from the star dancers, but she had a grace and elegance that caught the attention of the family. "I can dance," Emily said softly. The room fell silent. Mrs. Thompson looked at Emily with uncertainty. "But you're not trained for this kind of performance," she said. Emily smiled. "I may not be trained like the star dancer, but I can still dance. I've done this kind of thing before." She didn't seem nervous at all. In fact, she was calm and confident. But that confidence didn't settle everyone's nerves. Many family members exchanged looks, unsure about whether this was the right decision. As Emily walked toward the stage, the whispers in the room grew louder. Some of the older relatives shook their heads, thinking that this was a terrible idea. "She's not even a professional," one aunt muttered. "We're going to lose the whole crowd," another cousin added. But despite the doubts, Emily kept walking with quiet determination. She had no choice but to try. The event was already in jeopardy, and there was no time to find someone else. She had to give it her all. Emily climbed onto the stage, and for a moment, everything went quiet. The audience's eyes were on her, and they waited to see what she would do. She stood there for a few seconds, her hands gently resting at her sides, as if she was deciding how to begin. She could feel the weight of everyone's expectations pressing down on her. She knew they weren't sure about her. They didn't think she was the right person for this job. The music started softly, and Emily took a deep breath, stepping forward. With the first few moves, she seemed to float across the stage, moving with a grace that surprised the crowd. Her dancing wasn't like the star dancers, but it was beautiful in its own way. The crowd watched in silence, unsure of what to make of it. Some guests began to nod slightly, impressed by her skill, while others whispered amongst themselves, still not convinced. Emily continued, her body moving fluidly, each step more confident than the last. But behind the applause, there was still a sense of unease. The family was watching closely, and they were not all sure about this new ballerina. Was this the right choice? Could she really replace the star dancer? Would the audience accept her? These thoughts swirled in the minds of the family, and no one knew what to expect next. The night was far from over, and what happened next would change everything. As Emily danced on, the tension in the room was thick. Would she be able to handle the pressure, or would the family regret this decision? The audience was still unsure, and so was Emily. The story was just beginning. As Emily continued to dance, a growing tension filled the room. The crowd's reactions were mixed. Some guests were nodding their heads, impressed by her smooth, graceful moves. She was clearly talented, but her style was different from what they were used to. The star dancer had always brought a certain energy to the performance, a spark that everyone looked forward to. Emily, on the other hand, had a more classical, delicate touch to her dancing. It was beautiful in its own way, but it was not what the audience had been expecting. The family was equally divided. Some relatives were beginning to soften their judgment, seeing that Emily was trying her best. Others, however, could not hide their disappointment. "This isn't what we planned," one cousin whispered under her breath, looking at the stage with a frown. "She's not like the star dancer." Another family member shook his head, arms crossed, clearly unimpressed. "This is a disaster," he muttered. In the corner, the star dancer's best friend, Amanda, was watching with a cold expression. She had been the one to introduce the star dancer to the family years ago, and she had always seen herself as the protector of the performances. When she saw Emily stepping in, she couldn't believe it. She had known the star dancer for so long and felt that no one could replace her, no matter how good they were. The thought of Emily dancing in her place made her feel uneasy. Amanda had always been the one to support the star dancer, and now she couldn't hide her anger. She had not expected Emily to be so confident. The more she watched, the more frustrated she became. It wasn't just the performance she was angry about. It was the fact that Emily had been put in a position where she was expected to perform at such a high standard. To her, it felt unfair. As the music swelled, Emily's movements became more intense. She tried to keep her focus, but she could feel the eyes of the family and guests on her. The whispers in the crowd were growing louder, and Emily couldn't ignore them. She knew some people didn't believe in her, but she had no choice but to continue. This was her moment to prove herself. She was halfway through her performance when something unexpected happened. Emily was spinning gracefully, but as she attempted a difficult turn, her foot slipped. Time seemed to slow down as she wobbled, struggling to keep her balance. The audience gasped. Emily quickly recovered, but the moment of vulnerability had already happened. Her heart raced as she finished the move, and she could feel the pressure building. From the corner of the room, Amanda's eyes narrowed. She had seen the mistake and couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. "I knew it," she thought, arms folded tightly across her chest. "She's not cut out for this." She wasn't the only one who felt that way. Some of the relatives exchanged glances, their expressions full of doubt. Despite the slip, Emily carried on, doing her best to finish the routine. She could feel her nerves threatening to take over, but she pushed them aside. With every step, she focused on the rhythm of the music, trying to ignore the harsh whispers and the eyes that followed her every movement. As she neared the end of the routine, Emily's legs felt like lead, but she gritted her teeth and pushed through. The performance ended with a quiet, awkward pause. Emily stood in the center of the stage, her chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. For a moment, there was complete silence. No applause, no cheers. The family and guests simply stared. Then the clapping began. It was soft at first, hesitant, almost as if the audience was unsure whether they should be applauding or not. Slowly, the applause grew louder, but it wasn't the loud and enthusiastic response that the star dancer had always received. It felt more like a polite courtesy, a sign of appreciation for Emily's effort rather than admiration for her performance. Emily slowly made her way off the stage, her heart still pounding in her chest. As she stepped down, she could feel the weight of the family's eyes on her. Some of them were nodding, seemingly impressed by her determination. Others were still whispering, their faces full of disappointment. Amanda, however, couldn't hold back anymore. She stood up, walking over to Emily with a look of disdain. "You shouldn't have done this," she said, her voice low but sharp. "You're not ready for this kind of performance." Emily looked at her, feeling a wave of frustration and sadness wash over her. She didn't want to argue, but she couldn't help but feel hurt by Amanda's words. "I did my best," Emily replied quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Amanda shook her head, her expression cold. "Your best wasn't good enough. You'll never be able to replace her." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Emily standing in the shadows of the stage. Emily was left alone in the corner of the room, unsure of what to do next. She had danced her heart out, but she knew it wasn't enough to win over the family. The disappointment in their eyes was clear, and Amanda's harsh words echoed in her mind. But despite everything, Emily wasn't ready to give up. She had come this far, and she wouldn't let one mistake define her. But as the night went on, it became clear that the family's reaction to her performance was far from over. As the evening continued, the tension in the room seemed to hang in the air, thick and heavy. The guests were still milling around, enjoying their meals, but there was no denying the shift in the atmosphere. The excitement from earlier had dimmed, replaced by a quiet undercurrent of uncertainty. Some guests continued to speak in hushed tones, clearly discussing the performance. Emily could hear snippets of their conversation as she walked back to the family table, where the relatives were still gathered, talking amongst themselves. The applause from her performance had been polite, but it hadn't been the kind of raucous cheer that the star dancer used to receive. Emily had hoped for a warmer reception, even if it wasn't the same as the usual excitement, but it was clear the family was divided. There were a few smiles here and there, but mostly, the family seemed lost in their own thoughts. Some relatives avoided eye contact with her altogether, while others looked at her with pity. The disappointment was palpable. Amanda, who had been watching the performance with a scowl, was now whispering to another family member. Emily didn't want to look, but she could sense Amanda's judgment without even seeing it. She tried to ignore the nagging feeling in the back of her mind, but it was hard. Was she really that bad? Had she ruined the evening for everyone? Emily's heart sank when she saw the familiar face of the star dancer's father. He had been sitting at the front table earlier, eagerly awaiting his daughter's performance. Now his face was filled with concern. He was older and usually a calm man, but his expression was full of worry. He caught Emily's eye for a brief moment, and she immediately looked away, feeling her throat tighten. She didn't want to face him. She couldn't bear to see the disappointment in his eyes, too. "Emily," a voice called. It was Mrs. Thompson, the event coordinator. She had been working hard to make sure everything went smoothly. Emily had noticed her earlier, running around trying to fix last-minute details. But now, Mrs. Thompson's voice sounded softer, almost apologetic. "Can we talk for a moment?" she asked, her voice low. Emily nodded and followed Mrs. Thompson to the side, away from the rest of the family and guests. "You did your best," Mrs. Thompson said, her tone gentle but serious. "And I appreciate that. But there's no denying that the performance didn't go as planned. The audience, well, they weren't expecting that." Emily took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. She had expected some feedback, but it still stung to hear it out loud. "I know," she said quietly. "I tried my hardest. I wasn't sure if I could do it, but I had to try." Mrs. Thompson nodded thoughtfully. "I understand, but you've got to know that the family wanted something bigger. The star dancer is their shining star, and they've been looking forward to her performance for so long. It's not easy for anyone to step in and fill those shoes." Emily felt a lump in her throat. "I didn't mean to disappoint anyone," she whispered. "I know you didn't," Mrs. Thompson replied, placing a comforting hand on Emily's shoulder. But sometimes, no matter how hard we try, things don't go as we hope. You need to understand that it's not about you. It's about expectations. And the family had big expectations tonight. As Mrs. Thompson spoke, Emily couldn't help but feel like she was fading into the background. The weight of her failure seemed to grow heavier by the second. She had done what she thought was right, but she wasn't good enough for them. She wasn't the star dancer. The truth hit her harder than she expected. From across the room, Amanda was watching. She had noticed the brief exchange between Emily and Mrs. Thompson and could see the defeated look on Emily's face. A small, almost smug smile tugged at the corners of Amanda's lips. She knew that Emily was feeling the weight of the judgment. It was clear from the way Emily held herself. Head down, eyes full of disappointment, Amanda couldn't help but feel a sense of victory. After all, this was exactly what she had expected. Emily had failed to live up to the expectations, and Amanda wasn't going to let her forget it. But as the evening went on, something strange began to happen. As the family members continued their quiet discussions, a few started to change their minds. One of Emily's cousins, who had been among the most vocal critics earlier, now found himself looking at her with a more sympathetic expression. He had watched her performance closely and noticed something. Even though the moves weren't as perfect as the star dancers, there was a sincerity in Emily's movements. There was something about her performance that made him feel like she was genuinely trying to connect with the audience, even if it wasn't perfect. He leaned over to his sister. "You know, I don't think she was as bad as we thought," he said quietly. "It wasn't like the star dancer, but it was different. In a good way." His sister raised an eyebrow, but didn't disagree. "Maybe you're right," she replied softly. "She's not the star dancer, but she gave it everything she had." Meanwhile, Emily, still standing by the side of the room, was beginning to feel like she didn't belong. She had done what she thought was best, but it hadn't been enough. She wasn't part of the family's tradition. She wasn't the one they had all expected. And now, as the night carried on without her, she felt more alone than ever. The doubt crept in, and she started to wonder whether she had made a mistake by stepping in at all. But in the midst of her self-doubt, one thing was becoming clear. The night was far from over. And despite the disappointment, Emily was about to learn that sometimes, even the smallest actions can change everything. As Emily stood at the side of the room, the evening continued to unfold around her, but she couldn't shake the heavy feeling in her chest. She had tried her best, yet the room seemed to have moved on without her. It felt as though the family's disappointment had somehow seeped into every corner of the space, leaving her isolated. The once festive energy of the event had dimmed, replaced with awkward conversations and strained smiles. Amanda was still hovering near the front, watching Emily from afar. She seemed to take some kind of satisfaction in the tension, her arms crossed tightly. Emily could feel her eyes boring into her back, and the anger in Amanda's gaze was undeniable. She had been so sure that Emily wouldn't measure up, and now it seemed she was ready to make sure everyone knew she was right. Emily didn't want to let it affect her, but it was hard not to. Amanda's judgment felt like a cloud hanging over her, one that she couldn't escape no matter where she went. Emily glanced over at the family, noticing a few relatives speaking in hushed tones. They weren't talking about her directly, but she knew they were discussing her performance. The conversations were tense, with a lot of uncertainty in their voices. She could overhear bits of their words. "She just wasn't what we expected. I don't know if we can keep going like this. It's not the same without the star dancer." Despite the soft whispers, Emily could see the way some of them were still watching her. They weren't dismissing her entirely. There was something there, something almost like sympathy. She caught the eye of her cousin Rachel, who had been watching her earlier with doubt. But now Rachel gave her a small, almost unnoticeable nod, as if telling her she wasn't completely alone. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make Emily feel a tiny bit better. Maybe not all hope was lost. Amanda, however, wasn't so easily swayed. As Emily walked toward the refreshment table, hoping to collect herself and avoid further awkwardness, Amanda followed her. "I don't know why you even bothered. Amanda said, her voice sharp. "You're not ready for this kind of thing. This was supposed to be the highlight of the evening, and you ruined it." Emily stopped in her tracks, her heart sinking. She had tried so hard to step up, to do something for the family. But Amanda's words hit her like a slap. It wasn't just a comment on her performance. It felt like Amanda was attacking her for even attempting to take the star dancer's place. "I didn't ruin anything," Emily replied, keeping her voice calm despite the rush of emotions inside her. "I did the best I could. I'm sorry it wasn't perfect." Amanda sneered. "Perfect? You're not even close. You were out of your depth from the moment you stepped on that stage." Before Emily could respond, Rachel approached them, her expression serious. "Amanda, that's enough," she said firmly, standing between the two women. "We get it. You're upset, but that's no reason to be cruel." Amanda opened her mouth to protest, but Rachel didn't let her speak. "You've been criticizing Emily all night, and it's not helping anyone. She stepped in when no one else could. Maybe it wasn't perfect, but she tried. That's more than I can say for some people." Amanda was taken aback by Rachel's sudden defense. She opened her mouth to argue. But this time, Rachel turned to Emily with an apologetic look in her eyes. "I didn't realize how much pressure you were under, Emily. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have been so quick to judge." Emily gave Rachel a small, grateful smile, feeling a little lighter at the words. "It's okay," she said softly. "I just wanted to help. I thought if I gave it my all, maybe I could show everyone that I'm capable of more." Rachel nodded, her expression softening. "You did, and I think some of us are starting to see that." She glanced over at the family table, where some of the relatives were still watching the two of them. "It's just hard for people to accept change sometimes, but it doesn't mean you're not good enough." For a moment, the weight of the night's events seemed to lift just a little bit. Emily could feel a sense of relief that she hadn't experienced since stepping on that stage. Rachel's words didn't make everything perfect, but they gave her something she hadn't felt much of that evening: support. Amanda, still standing off to the side, seemed to simmer in silence, but she didn't say anything more. Emily didn't know if she had won her over, but at least for the moment, she didn't have to face her harsh words anymore. The music played on, and the guests continued to enjoy their meal. But as Emily looked around, she noticed something. Some of the relatives who had been talking quietly before were now watching her with more interest. A few nodded in her direction, as though they were beginning to change their opinion. It wasn't a huge shift, but it was something. The night wasn't going as planned, and Emily knew she would never fully replace the star dancer in the family's eyes. But maybe, just maybe, there was room for her too. The tension hadn't completely disappeared, but as Emily stood there, taking in the room, she felt a spark of hope that hadn't been there before. She had done her best. She had tried. And that was all she could do. The night was far from over, and there were still moments left to change the course of the evening. Would the family accept her or continue to doubt her? Emily didn't know yet, but she was starting to believe that she might just have a place here after all. The night stretched on, but the atmosphere in the room had shifted. Emily could feel it, though it wasn't an overwhelming change. It was subtle, like a quiet hum under the surface. The tension from earlier was still there, but it wasn't as heavy as it had been before. People were beginning to move on, adjusting to the new reality of the event. The star dancer was no longer the center of attention, and Emily was left to figure out where she stood. As the evening progressed, Emily found herself standing at the edge of the room again, away from the bustle of the crowd. The food had been served, and guests were chatting in groups, but Emily didn't feel like part of any of them. She was still trying to process everything that had happened. Her mind replayed her performance over and over, trying to figure out what went wrong, what she could have done differently. She knew she had made mistakes, but it was hard to pinpoint exactly where she had lost control. Every misstep, every missed beat, played out in her mind like a loop she couldn't escape. But as she stood there, lost in her thoughts, a familiar voice pulled her from her haze. It was Rachel again, approaching her with a soft smile. "Hey," she said gently. "Mind if I join you for a second?" Emily shook her head, grateful for the company. "Of course," she replied, her voice quieter than usual. Rachel looked around, then leaned in a little closer. "I've been talking to a few people. Some of them are starting to realize something. They're seeing you in a different light. It's not the loud applause or the cheers, but it's there. People are starting to recognize that you gave it your all." Emily's heart lifted just slightly at Rachel's words. "Do you really think so?" Rachel nodded. "I do. I think they're starting to understand. It wasn't perfect, but it was genuine. And people respect that, even if they didn't say it out loud." For the first time that night, Emily allowed herself a small, hopeful smile. "Thanks. That means a lot." She looked around the room, noticing the way some of the guests were now glancing her way. It wasn't the same look as before. The judgment had faded, replaced by something else. Curiosity, maybe. A bit of understanding. "I'm glad I didn't just mess everything up," Emily said softly, almost to herself. "I really wanted to help make this event special." Rachel placed a hand on Emily's arm. "You did. Maybe not in the way we all expected, but you did. You stepped up when no one else could. And that's worth something." Just as Emily was about to reply, the music changed, signaling the start of a slower, more relaxed song. Some of the guests began to sway gently, while others sat back and chatted. The evening was winding down, but there was still a sense of unfinished business in the air. A few minutes passed before Emily felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned to find one of her cousins, Ben, standing behind her. His face was unreadable, but his eyes held a kind of seriousness that made Emily pause. "Hey, can I talk to you for a second?" Ben asked, his tone more serious than usual. "Of course," Emily said, a little taken aback. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she followed him to a quieter corner of the room, away from the rest of the family. "Look, I've been thinking," Ben began, "about your performance. I didn't think it was all that bad. In fact, it was kind of impressive, considering the pressure you were under." Emily blinked, unsure if she had heard him right. "You really think so?" Ben nodded. "Yeah. I mean, I could tell you were nervous, and it wasn't the same as what we're used to, but you really put yourself out there. It wasn't perfect, but who's perfect, right?" Emily didn't know what to say. Hearing those words from Ben, someone she had grown up with, felt like a weight lifting off her shoulders. "Thanks, Ben. I needed to hear that." He gave her a small, reassuring smile. "I know. Look, it's hard. You're trying to fill big shoes, and no one can do that perfectly. But that doesn't mean you didn't try. And trying is more than most people do." As he turned to walk away, he paused for a moment and looked back at Emily. "You belong here, Emily. Don't forget that." The simple words hit Emily harder than she expected. They were just what she needed to hear, and in that moment, she realized something. It wasn't about being perfect or replacing someone else. It was about doing what she could, giving her best, and letting that speak for itself. Back in the main room, the atmosphere seemed to relax even more. The tension had finally started to fade into something more comfortable, more familiar. The family had accepted that this night hadn't gone as planned, but they had also begun to accept Emily. Not as the star dancer, but as herself. By the time the night was drawing to a close, Emily was standing at the edge of the room again, watching the last few guests slowly gather their things. The lights were dimming, and the room was quieter now. The earlier chaos had settled into a calm, peaceful end to the evening. She had gone through so much during the night, from the harsh criticisms to the quiet moments of support. And now, as the event began to wind down, she realized that she had come out of it stronger than she had been before. She might not have been the star dancer, but she had proven something to herself, and maybe, just maybe, to the rest of the family as well. When she walked to the door, Rachel caught her one last time. "You did good, Emily. You really did." Emily smiled, a genuine, warm smile. "Thanks. I think I'm starting to believe that." The night was coming to an end, and the once lively family event was now filled with the soft hum of conversations winding down. The room had lost the hustle and bustle of earlier, and the guests were gathering their belongings, ready to head home. Yet despite the fatigue settling in, Emily stood in a quiet corner, reflecting on the whirlwind of emotions she had gone through that evening. It had been a night full of uncertainty, doubt, and awkward moments. She had stepped in for the star dancer, knowing she wasn't her, but still hoping to make an impact. The performance hadn't been perfect, far from it, but she had given everything she had. And slowly, people were beginning to notice. As she stood there, lost in thought, she saw a few family members glance her way. It wasn't the same look as before, not the judgment or pity from earlier. This time, they were watching her with something else. Curiosity, maybe even admiration. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Emily could feel it. She wasn't just the replacement anymore. She was starting to be seen for who she was. Amanda was across the room, speaking to some of the other relatives. Her posture was stiff, her face a little tense, but Emily couldn't bring herself to care anymore. Amanda's harsh words earlier had stung, but she no longer felt the need to let them control her. Emily had tried, and that was all that mattered. Amanda could say what she wanted, but Emily knew she had done her best. Rachel appeared beside her once more, a soft smile on her face. "Hey," she said, her voice light. "How are you feeling now?" Emily sighed, a little overwhelmed. "Better, I think. It's been a long night." Rachel nodded, glancing around the room. "Yeah, but you've made it through, and that's saying something. I think you've earned a bit of respect from the family tonight." Emily wasn't sure if that was true. Some of them were still unsure, she could tell. But the idea that she had at least made a mark, that she hadn't completely disappointed everyone, made her heart swell with a quiet sense of pride. "I don't know if they'll ever completely accept me as the star dancer," Emily said softly, almost to herself. Rachel shook her head. "It's not about replacing anyone, Emily. It's about you being you. They'll get that eventually." Emily smiled at her cousin's words. She hadn't quite figured out where she stood yet, but she knew one thing for certain now. She had nothing to prove to anyone but herself. The music had stopped playing, and the last of the guests were saying their goodbyes. Emily walked toward the door, her feet light, though her body still felt exhausted. The evening hadn't gone as planned, but something inside her had shifted. She no longer felt the pressure to be someone else. She didn't have to fill the shoes of the star dancer. She just had to walk in her own. As she reached the doorway, Ben, her cousin, approached her again. His expression was warm, and he gave her a small nod of approval. "I wanted to say, Emily, you did great tonight. I know it wasn't what anyone expected, but you did your best, and that counts for a lot." Emily's heart skipped a beat at his words. "Thank you, Ben. That means more than you know." Ben smiled, clapping her gently on the back. "You belong here, Emily. Don't let anyone make you feel like you don't." Those words, so simple, yet so meaningful, were the final piece she needed. She wasn't just a placeholder for someone else. She wasn't there to try to live up to someone else's legacy. She was there to make her own mark, to step into her own story. As the last of the family members left the event, Emily took a deep breath. The evening hadn't gone as she had hoped, but it had still been an experience she wouldn't forget. She had learned something valuable, that she didn't have to be perfect to be enough. She didn't have to be anyone else to fit in. The night was over, but Emily knew that this was just the beginning. Her journey had only just started. And next time, she would be ready. She would take what she had learned from tonight and grow from it. There would be challenges ahead, but Emily was no longer afraid of them. She had stepped out of the shadow of someone else and was finally starting to stand on her own. And that was something worth celebrating. As the last few guests trickled out of the venue, Emily lingered in the quiet space, her mind replaying the events of the evening. The lights were dimming, and the soft murmur of voices had finally faded into silence. The once bustling room now felt empty, yet Emily wasn't sure whether the emptiness she felt was physical or emotional. She had spent the night trying to prove herself, trying to show her family that she was capable. But it hadn't been easy. Every step had been a struggle, every turn filled with the weight of their expectations. She hadn't replaced the star dancer as she had hoped. She hadn't been perfect, but something had shifted within her, something she hadn't anticipated. Rachel had been right. It wasn't about being perfect or filling someone else's shoes. It was about being herself. And while it was still hard to shake the doubt that had clouded her mind for most of the evening, Emily could feel a change within her. She wasn't just the backup anymore. She wasn't just the one who stepped in when someone else couldn't. She was Emily, and maybe that was enough. She glanced over at her cousin Ben, who had stayed behind to help with the cleanup. He gave her a nod, his way of silently acknowledging her strength that night. Even Amanda, who had been so critical earlier, was no longer as menacing. Emily hadn't expected her to apologize, but she could sense the slightest shift in Amanda's attitude. It wasn't much, but it was something. "Hey," Rachel called out, her voice cutting through Emily's thoughts. "You okay?" Emily looked up and nodded, her smile genuine, even if faint. "Yeah, I'm better now. Thanks for everything tonight, Rachel." Rachel grinned, walking over to her. "You really hung in there. I'm proud of you." A warm feeling spread through Emily at Rachel's words. It felt like the first time all evening that she had been truly seen, not as someone filling in for someone else, but as herself. "Thanks," Emily said, her voice steady. "I think I'm starting to see it too." The last of the family members had left, and it was finally time to go. As they made their way toward the exit, Emily couldn't help but feel a quiet satisfaction inside her. She had made it through. She had faced the judgment, the doubts, and the fear of not measuring up, and she had come out stronger on the other side. She wasn't the star dancer. She wasn't the perfect performer everyone had expected her to be. But that was okay. She didn't need to be perfect. She only needed to be herself. And maybe, just maybe, that was more than enough for the people who mattered. As Emily stepped out into the cool night air, she took a deep breath, letting the crispness of it clear her mind. The event might be over, but this wasn't the end of her story. It was only the beginning. The night had been filled with challenges, but it had also been filled with moments of growth. And as she walked away from the venue, Emily knew one thing for certain. She had done her best, and that was something no one could ever take away from her.